So what? So, you know, there's less individuals in some fisheries, you know, maybe they're a little smaller, you know, why does that matter? Well, from a conservation perspective, of course, you know, we're concerned about, you know, again, that idea of ecology, right? How do all the pieces get put together, and as things start to get removed, what happens to the overall system? This is you know, artist's rendition that depicts the changes in a kelp forest here in California from a few decades ago to what you see today. And again, you know, the image for today, there's still fish, there's still kelp. You know, the water looks pretty clean. It's not, you know, it's not a terrible shot. But you have to know what would have been there in a natural system, what would have been there 50 or 100 years ago to essentially know what you're missing. This is a concept that some of you may have heard of, the idea of the shifting baseline, that essentially each generation resets the clock. And their idea of what's normal is what they experienced maybe when they were young, or the first time if they're a scuba diver, the first time they went under the water. That's their idea of how things, you know, should be, what a healthy system looks like. And so over time, as the species get smaller or there are less individuals, your idea of normal gets reset, and essentially you're accepting something that's really not acceptable. Several months ago, I was down in Southern California at a hearing before the Fish and Game Commission regarding this idea of creating marine protected areas in Southern California. We'll get to that a little bit later. But it was a very contentious meeting, probably 800 people in the room, crowded house. About half of the folks there really, you know, strong advocates wanted more protection. The other half fishermen who were concerned about losing access to places that they had traditionally fished. So pretty split crowd, folks on both sides. Very, very heated discussion. And a young man got up to testify, probably in his early mid-20s, scuba diver. He said he was a scuba diver, he was in the water, you know, every week, and he wanted to assure the Fish and Game Commission and everyone else in the audience that they didn't need to be worried, that the ocean was fine. He was in the water every week, there were plenty of fish, really it wasn't a problem. We didn't need these marine protected areas because the ocean was fine. He was sincere. I don't think he was lying. I think he was telling the truth from his experience. The problem was he didn't have the experience that some of the folks who've been diving 30, 40, 50 years ago had. And so essentially, he didn't know what he was missing. So here in California, recognizing that things have changed and that we could be doing a better job and that there was this tool, marine protected areas, that could help us do a better job, the California legislature passed a law back in 1999, the Marine Life Protection Act. We had marine protected areas in California really going back decades. The Hopkins Marine Life Refuge was established in the 30s. So this is a tool that had been used in California sort of on an ad hoc basis. In most cases, the marine protected areas were few and far between and very, very small, and in many cases very permissive. So something that called itself a protected area, but actually you could pretty much do anything you wanted there. So what they refer to as paper parks, or protection in name only. So the legislature looked at what we had on the books already in California, said, you know what, this doesn't make a lot of sense. We have a lot of marine protected areas in theory, but in practice they're not really providing a lot of protection. We can do better. Let's redo this, and let's make sure that California's marine protected areas are created in a scientifically based, systematic way. So just as we have in our park system, you know, we have redwood forests, we have desert parks, we try to protect a range of habitats on the land side. Let's make sure we're doing the same in the ocean. Let's make sure we have kelp forests protected, we have sandy bottom, we have tide pools, we have the full range, submarine canyons, the full range of different kinds of habitats offshore included in our protected areas. The goals of the Marine Life Protection Act really are pretty impressive. They're pretty progressive. It's this idea of protecting biodiversity, of protecting ecosystems. So not a single species, not let's protect one kind of fish species that we like to fish for, but instead let's protect the habitat and all of the species associated with that. Again, the idea, this idea of ecology, of let's protect all the pieces as we're doing our tinkering. And I like to call it sort of like a Noah's Ark, right? We want to have two of everything. Let's make sure we have replicates. Let's make sure we have multiple sets of kelp forest and submarine canyon and tide pools. Let's include all of the important habitats in California in our system of marine protected areas, and let's replicate them more than once. So we don't want to just have one kelp forest, but we want to make sure that we have kelp forests in Southern California, in the Central Coast, and in Northern California protected. So what does it mean to have a marine protected area? Under California law, there are essentially different flavors, different types of marine protected areas. Marine reserves, where the area is fully protected, no fishing at all is allowed. That's depicted here as the red area. Marine parks, where recreational fishing may be allowed. And then marine conservation areas, where there's some kind of special rules in place, but also some recreational and commercial fishing allowed. So in California, we've used all of those different tools, those 3 different tools, depending on what the goal was for a particular area. And our marine protected areas reflect all of those different tools, as I said. The law was passed originally back in 1999, but it wasn't until 2004 that the current effort to create marine protected areas in California really picked up steam. It was an issue that former Governor Schwarzenegger took on as his own and decided that he really wanted to see this move forward and put a lot of his sort of political oomph behind it. And so from 2004 until now is when things have really picked up, and the planning effort to create our marine protected areas has really picked up steam. There's a timeline that just should demonstrate that again. The law was passed back in 1999. There were actually a couple of false starts to try to implement it. And then again in 2004 is when things really picked up. The state decided to take a regional approach to designing marine protected areas. California's coastline is over 2,000 miles long. A lot of diversity. Obviously, Humboldt County and Orange County don't have a whole lot in common. And I think it was really smart to recognize both the ecological differences, but also really the human differences, the cultural differences, the community differences between different parts of the state, and recognize that try to do a planning. Imagine trying to plan all of our state parks at once. We didn't have any, and now we're going to just create them all over the state. Sounds kind of good, actually. If you could do that, it might look a little different. But the idea was to take a phased approach, bite off a chunk at a time instead of trying to do it all at once, because it would just be overwhelming for the state to try to manage such an extensive planning process all at once. So here on the Central Coast, we were the start. We were the first phase. Our marine protected areas were put in place in 2007, so they've been in place for a while now. And then the second phase, North Central Coast, from essentially Año Nuevo up to Point Marina. Those marine protected areas went into effect in May of last year, May 2010. Southern California, the marine protected areas have been adopted by the Fish and Game Commission. They were voted on in December, just December of last year, and they have not gone into effect yet. So they're not in the water, the rules aren't in effect yet, but we anticipate that to occur later this year. And then in the far north, the Point Arena up to the Oregon border, the marine protected areas have been designed but have not yet been voted on by the Fish and Game Commission. So we're about 3/4 of the way through and anticipate having the statewide network completed probably by early next year. In each region of the state, there's been a similar process to create these marine protected areas. So essentially what the state has done is brought together ocean users, the fishermen and scuba divers and conservationists and others who live in the coastal communities, and asked them to work together and try to come up with ideas for how to design the new marine protected areas. Those stakeholder groups are advised by scientists, a scientific advisory team. You're going to hear from some of the folks who've served on those scientific advisory teams during the subsequent panel. So they're not just making it up, but they're trying to follow the best scientific recommendations that the state can provide. And then ultimately, it's a body appointed by the governor, the Fish and Game Commission, that has to decide and adopt the marine protected areas before they go into law. So it's been really an extraordinary effort. This isn't typically how decisions get made in government. Usually there's somebody working for a state agency that comes up with a plan, and maybe they have a few public hearings, and then it gets adopted and you move forward. This has been really, we call it my team refers to it as a exhaustive and exhausting effort. But it's kind of been an experiment in public policy to have the folks who are most affected, the people who live along the coast, really take a big role in trying to figure out how to do a better job of protecting the resources. The stakeholder involvement piece is really challenging. It's hard to get conservationists and fishermen to sit down together and try to figure out areas where fishermen can't fish. Obviously, that can be controversial. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Each of these images shows a conservationist and a fisherman trying to hash something out over the course of the marine protected area negotiations.